Hello, everybody, and welcome to Salto Notte. I'm extremely happy and honored to introduce this presentation with Michael Pollan, which, of course, everybody of you knows. He is one of the most prominent scientific journalists in the world, and he has written various very important books about food, all published by Adelphi. And the last one, How to Change Your Mind, in Italian, Come cambiare la tua mente, which makes not understand the double meaning that it has in the English version, is about the so-called psychedelic renaissance, which is the return in the scientific and especially medical scene of substances which looked like a thing of the past, a thing of the 60s or of the 70s, like LSD, psilocybin, which is the active principle of magic mushrooms, or ayahuasca, which is an Amazonian brew made with DMT, which is a tryptamine similar in structure to psilocybin. And this subject has returned with great strength in the media and in the scientific community in the last 10 years. And the book by Michael Pollan was a real game changer in the debate because it was a long time since an author so respected and so known for his work also in other fields approached the field of psychedelic science. It was also a great game changer for me because, for example, I gifted this book to all the people who had doubts about these substances or these themes. It is really significant also because it constitutes also a complete history of psychedelic science, and also it's very fun to read, because, and I think this is important because sometimes people perceive that scientific essays can be boring or heavy. This is not the case with Michael Pollan because it's a really exciting adventure, also because the author puts himself in the field. So, hi, Michael, thank you. It's a great honor for us to have you with us.
Thank you, Vanni. Well, it's wonderful to be here. I only wish I could be here in person. I would like nothing more than to be able to get on a plane and fly to Turin. And I love being in Italy, and it's unfortunate we can't do this in person.
I hope there will be a chance when you do another book. We will attract you with genuine food in Tuscany and also in Piedmont, and maybe organize a live one. But we're very happy to have you all here, even by Zoom. In these years, we have seen a very big surge of psychedelic research. Now there are even entire departments like the one which is led by Robin Carhart Harris. And even if this renaissance was in the air, for me, it was a bit surprising to see in the last 10 years how the mainstream media changed their approach to psychedelics. They started to cover the subject in a more sober, non-hysterical way, which was unimaginable just a few years ago. How do you think the general culture is shifting with respect to psychedelic science and medicine?
Well, you know, it's interesting to look at how the media has covered psychedelics going all the way back to the 1950s. And that's when we had this first period of research that very few people know about. I think most people assume psychedelics were invented in the 1960s, and they're so closely associated with the 60s counterculture. But the media was very positive about psychedelics from when they were first being researched in the early 50s through about 1965. And that's when this backlash begins in the United States, but also worldwide, that psychedelics, which had been treated as a legitimate tool for treating people with mental health problems, with depression and anxiety and obsession and things like that. I mean, they were really regarded as a psychiatric wonder drug in the 50s. There were 6 international conferences on LSD between 1950 and 1965. And the media tends to follow the lead of science on these things. And science was very enthusiastic. But in the mid-60s, when the drugs became associated with the counterculture, and especially in America with the anti-war movement, the anti-Vietnam War movement, the media turned, I think led somewhat by the government. The media is less independent, I think, of official opinion than it likes to think very often. And so you started seeing a different kind of story about psychedelics, which was that people were having, you know, one-way trips to insanity, and they were, you know, jumping off of buildings because they thought they could fly. And, you know, some bad things did happen on psychedelics. There are risks, without question, but they got exaggerated. And the prevailing narrative became that these were drugs of abuse, that they would drive you crazy, that and they were a threat to society. And President Nixon, after he gets elected in '68, launches a drug war, which really demonizes LSD and psilocybin. And so that's kind of where things are left. And this negative publicity in the media, and changes in the law, by the way, because the drugs were not illegal till the late '60s, spooked the scientists, and they stopped doing research. It became not respectable to research psychedelics, and the research kind of died away. When the research resumes, which really happens very quietly around the year 2000, a handful of people who never lost faith in the power of these medicines to heal people and improve society, they gradually put together some funding, got the research going, and the results were so positive, especially in some early trials to treat people who were dying and were paralyzed by their fear of death, that they got significant relief. In fact, their whole attitude toward dying changed. That as people started writing about this, and it was strong science, it was rigorous, it was double-blind, you know, controlled as best you can with psychedelics. The media changed again, and the drug war is ending. I think that's part of it. I think that people in America, at least, have, and not only in America, have come to realize the folly of, first of all, lumping all drugs together. Psychedelics and opiates are very different things. Psychedelics are not addictive. They do not, they're not toxic to the body. There's no fatal dose of LSD, which is an astonishing fact. There's a fatal dose for the ibuprofen and the acetaminophen in your medicine cabinet. So the media has changed again, and you know, I feel like I'm part of that phenomenon, but it really has been driven by the science.
So nowadays, it became more easy to talk about psychedelics to cure problems like depression, end-of-life anxiety, or even addictions, which is interesting to separate them from other types of drugs. And maybe the approval around medical hemp has helped also this change of the narrative. But I feel that it's still a bit controversial when we talk about their ability to benefit somebody who is already well, by promoting, for example, mystical or spiritual experiences. Yet this, in your book, is a real key point. For example, the mystical experience appears crucial in helping people overcome the fear of death, or in general, making their life better. And this is something which maybe it has still to be worked on, because it's a bit counterintuitive for many people to use something to cure somebody who doesn't need any specific cure.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very big debate going on right now, whether these drugs should be available to people who are not technically sick. That, you know, what one of my sources in the book calls the betterment of well people. In other words, you're healthy, but you could be better. And it's important for us to realize, I think, that we all struggle with issues like depression and anxiety and the fear of death. You know, that's not just a problem for cancer patients. That's a problem for all of us. And that we're on a continuum with people who are struggling with depression or addiction. We're all addicted to something. It could be our phones. It could be, you know, it doesn't have to be a substance. It can be a certain kind of behavior. We're all stuck in habits we would like to change, habits of thought and habits of behavior. And so there is a role for a non-toxic drug that can help with those things. I mean, I think one of the most striking things about psychedelics is that they create a space for change. And, you know, I think there are many of us who want to change in one way or another. The whole idea of essentially administering a mystical experience to people sounds really weird, I realize. I mean, what are scientists doing and doctors messing around with mystical experience? So maybe we should define it a little bit. So one of the earlier studies was seeing whether psilocybin could predictably induce a mystical experience in someone. And of course, the psychologists have their surveys for everything, and they can measure a mystical experience based on a questionnaire that you fill out. But it's basically this sense of your ego going away and this sense of merging with something larger. You feel like you're part of nature or part of the universe or part of God. Your sense of, you transcend your sense of time and space, and you enter this kind of very fluid consciousness that's not bound by your skin or even by your sense of yourself. And it can be, you know, a terrifying or wonderful experience depending on your preparation for it. And this experience seems to predict a successful outcome in someone who's treating addiction or depression or obsession. All those problems are may really be manifestations of the same kind of mental formation, this rigidity of thinking, this being stuck in these repetitive grooves of rumination. And the mystical experience seems to shock the mind out of that and allow some new patterns to take form. So, I mean, you know, I would not say that these drugs are for everyone, but I think for people who are struggling with feeling stuck in their lives, whether it's creatively or emotionally, they offer this sort of, I mean, several of the doctors use the term reboot in the same way, you know, your computer gets all glitchy and if you turn it off and turn it back on, it's like, you know, things start moving more fluidly and quickly. And that's not a bad metaphor for what happens. It is a kind of reboot of the mind.
Well, everybody who is not a computer engineer knows that turning it off and then on is the best way to solve
the only thing I know what to do.
any problem in a computer. How to Change Your Mind has been described also as your most personal book. And indeed, one of its strengths to the reader is the fact that it includes not only theory, but also your personal experiences. So it mixes scientific essay with what we could call new journalism. And you tell that you were a reluctant psychonaut, but you had positive reactions nevertheless. What do you think they are the best insights you've gleaned from your research or from your experiences?
So I didn't feel I could do justice to this subject without using psychedelics and doing what I was writing about, the kinds of guided psychedelic experiences that people have when they're in a research or drug trial. So it's important to distinguish using psychedelics recreationally, as we say, just taking, you know, a tab of acid and going to a concert or taking a walk on the beach, and the way it's done in this container that after decades people have devised as the optimum way to use psychedelics in a therapeutic context, which essentially involves you're with a guide the whole time, preferably two. You're lying down, you're wearing eye shades and earphones, and the eye shades help you go inside. It becomes a very internal trip rather than just kind of reacting to all the sensory impressions coming in, which can be quite overwhelming. And the music is kind of guiding you too. It takes you out of the space you're in and it lets you travel. So I wanted to have this experience. I couldn't do it in an official drug trial. I didn't qualify for what they were studying at the time, but I did find we have an underground, a whole community of psychedelic guides who are operating without legal sanction but are very well-trained therapists. And so I found several of them, and I worked with them. And I was very nervous about the experience. I had not used psychedelics at the, when you're supposed to, as a 18-year-old or 20-year-old. I was too afraid of them then. So I was very naive coming into it. And I think that was a plus, because I could come see it for the first time. There's a way in which your first experience of something can never be repeated. The sense of wonder and awe and power, you'll never get that again. So with great reluctance, I ventured into this realm, and I had a series of experiences. I won't say they were all good. I had one that was truly terrifying, but I had several that taught me important things about myself, that became very interesting kind of self-explorations, and others that I still puzzle over to this day as to what they meant. Certain images that are kind of like my Zen koans, trying to explore what they mean. I had one experience that I'll never forget on a fairly high dose psilocybin trip that was guided by a woman who was very skilled. I felt very safe with her. And at a certain point, at the peak of the experience, I felt, in fact, I saw myself, my ego, the person identified as me, explode into a cloud of confetti or Post-it notes, and then land on the ground and turn into a puddle, a blue puddle. And I knew that was me, and I was no more. Yet I was still able to perceive the experience, which was a paradox. So I had this sense of awareness. I wasn't dead. I had this sense of awareness of what was going on around me, but without a self. I was thoughts, there was no thinker. I was perceptions, there was no perceiver. And it was the most amazing thing. And then after that, and it wasn't frightening at all. It seemed like absolutely how things were. It just objectively the case. And I then, my guide had put on this beautiful piece of music by Bach, one of the unaccompanied cello suites, number 2 in D minor, I think it was, a very sad piece of music. And I merged with this piece of music. I wouldn't say I heard it. There was no subject-object distinction. I became this piece of music. I was identical to it. And it was the most profound experience of music I'd ever had. And again, it was ecstatic in the literal sense of I was outside of myself, but it was very sad. It was all about death, but it was completely reconciled. And it remains one of the biggest experiences of my life, even though it only went on for a few minutes. And it made me think a lot about what is a self? What is a self good for? Are we identical to ourselves, or is that ego just one voice in our minds? And maybe there are others, and maybe you don't have to identify so closely with it. So that's the kind of journey it sends you on, and it can be incredibly provocative, and frankly, later in life, much more useful. I mean, we get so stuck in these grooves of thought, and so firmly identified with things as they've always been, that the idea that you could have a different kind of consciousness is kind of exciting.
This is very beautiful, and it's also interesting because besides medicine, it's true that the new science of psychedelics is opening up new studies in the mind field, simply in how our neural network works, which is something which is still not completely clear. But in the 60s, psychedelics were also a powerful engine of social change.
Yes.
Many things have changed today, also in the way people use them, as you just described. But do you think that they still hold such a potential? I'm thinking, for example, about the founder of the ecologist movement, Extinction Rebellion, who said she was inspired, found it while in ayahuasca trip. Maybe the return of the demand for shifts in consciousness is related to the crisis the world is living in this moment.
I think that's a very interesting question. I don't have a clear answer. I think there is some evidence that widespread use of psychedelics does change people. does change culture. I think it did in the 60s, whether you like what happened then or not. You had a generation of young people who had decided not to listen to the wisdom of their elders. And that we had what we called a generation gap. And the young had developed their own culture with their own way of dress, their own manners and mores, their own language, and their own politics. And that, I think, had a lot to do with a rite of passage many of them were undergoing, and that was the LSD trip, which changes people. And then you have individuals, many individuals who have talked about the role of psychedelics in their own creative evolution or finding their calling. The number of neuroscientists and psychiatrists and psychologists I have met who got interested in the mind because of a psychedelic experience is quite striking. People don't usually talk about it. There's still a taboo. But sometimes people do. Carlo Rovelli, the great writer and theoretical physicist, has spoken openly about the fact that it was an LSD trip, I think in his teenage years, that made him open to some of the really weird ideas of theoretical physics, that there are, infinite number of universes, that time can go backwards. All these ideas become more plausible after psychedelics. So I think we're seeing a lot of people come out of the closet to talk about the role of psychedelics in their lives. There was a real taboo against talking about it. People would just say, oh, I had this weird experience, and they'd put it in a box. And now I think, and the book has something to do with this, but it's also this change in the moment, people are taking out those formative experiences and looking at them again with the realization that it wasn't the molecule that gave you these ideas. It came out of here. And this, in the same way, dreams and fantasies reflect who you are. What happens to you on a psychedelic, that's your stuff. That's the products of your mind. And it's the products of the mind. And it's worth considering and taking seriously. So, whether it will solve the problems we face, this is a hard question. I mean, it's very interesting and suggestive to me that the two biggest problems we face as a civilization are the environmental crisis and tribalism, right? The breaking up into groups hostile to one another. Both of them involve objectifying the other, whether the other is nature or other people. Once you objectify them, you feel the right that you're superior and you can do what you want to them. Psychedelics dissolves that subject-object distinction. It makes you feel more connected, much more connected to the natural world, much more connected to people. You always hear people talking about their, discovery that love is the most important principle in the universe. And I had many experiences of feeling deeply connected to plants. I mean, they were like looking back at me. I mean, it was remarkable how I was no longer the only subject in my garden. There were a whole lot of subjects, and we were all equal. So, psychologists have measured some of this and found that people's sense of connection to nature increases after a single psychedelic trip. But that's all very suggestive, but how do you administer a drug to a whole civilization? You're not going to put LSD in the water. So do you give it to as many people as possible? Do you give it to the influencers in a society and hope that the new consciousness filters down? This is an argument that was going on in the 50s, actually, and it's going on again. And I don't know the answer. I don't know that you can give a drug, with the exception of fluoride, which we put in our water, to help with teeth decay. This is very different. So, but I think these drugs can teach us valuable lessons individually.
Well, thank you, Michael. I hope that things will go this way for sure. I remind to everybody who is watching us that the last book by Michael Pollan, How to Change Your Mind, Come Cambiare la Tua Mente in Italian, it's published by Adelphi. And also, I suggest that everybody checks out the Adelphi catalog for all the essays of Michael about food, because they are as great. Thank you very much, Michael.
Oh, thank you, Bonnie. What a pleasure talking to you.
I hope there will be a live session in the future.
I look forward to seeing you in person. Goodbye.
Ciao.